We are going to dive into some hot off the press research. This is 2025, and this is an amazing study in which they're looking at 3 different movement activities for children with autism. And what they found is you get 3 very different results depending on the type of activity. So I tell you this, details matter when it comes to your intervention. That's why you just can't blindly take an intervention off the shelf and adopt everything in that intervention. Within every single intervention I've studied, there's garbage. There's stuff that simply is ineffective. And you're also probably going to find some active ingredients, some needle movers. So when we look at the comparison today of these 3 movement activities, we can look and say, what are those needle movers? What is the difference between these 3 activities? Why is this activity superior? Why is this activity getting gains across developmental domains, whereas the others are not? Because if you keep everything the same, and in this study, it's a randomized controlled trial. So all 3 groups are equal because they have equal chance of being distributed to each group, causing equivalence amongst the groups. When all things are equal and you're using the same intervention strategies, you're simply changing the activity. Then you can say, this is important. This is an active ingredient. This makes a difference. This is something that we're going to pay attention to so we can apply it to our practice. What we're going to see is the intervention was so effective that after a 2-month period, and 2 months is how long it takes if you're in the communication field to show speech and language gains and standardized testing. So the research indicates you need 2 months to show the gains have generalized in a testing situation. That's how long it takes. Well, these authors, with this movement activity that they did, they showed standardized test gains, okay, in the areas we're going to talk about in a minute, of, it's called an effect size of a medium to large effect size. So what you're talking about here is like half to whole standard deviation gains in multiple areas for this certain type of movement activity. So that's what we're going to want to pay attention to. That's where the active ingredient lies. That's where you're going to want to put your eggs in that basket, because autism is a pervasive developmental condition that impacts many different developmental domains. It's multifactorial in nature. So you need an intervention that's multiple factorial in nature. What I'm going to share with you today is what you can do if you're a speech pathologist, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you work with or know a child with autism. This is what we're going to want to do, because this is simply going to be much more effective as a movement activity than the other types of movement activities are. So we have to dive into this because it is that good. When you're talking about only 10 sessions that are perhaps 45 minutes long, 2 times a week, and after a 2-month period, you're making gains that are a half to full standard deviation in multiple domains, that is very impressive. That's something you want to take notes on. This is something you want to incorporate into your practice in your own way. I know we all have a different back porch. I know we all do it differently. And I encourage you to do something different, not only in your own practice, but do something different from how I do things. Because you have unique superpowers, and you have a unique caseload, and you have a unique back porch. So it shouldn't look like what I'm doing, but I'm going to share with you, this is what you need to pay attention to. This is what works. Let's look into this article. I want to give you a little bit of background into movement research, because a lot of people will say, I'm not a researcher. How do you have time to do research? And I am a researcher. I love learning. This is something that brings me great joy. And I can tell you an author you want to pay attention to. And her name is Anyana Bhat, Bhat, and the first name is Anjana. She is a professor from University of Delaware. What she is a workhorse. You are going to see so many articles published by this young professor. She is churning out the research, and it's all about movement for children with autism and the impact these type of movement activities have on multiple domains, this cascading impact for children with autism. She's also in the area of neuroscience and in physiology and also in physical therapy. She's in a few different departments. So she takes a really neat approach to autism intervention and the importance of focusing on movement. She is also quite an advocate in her research in showing that these children are grossly underserved in their movement intervention. She's asking the questions that everyone should be asking. Close to 90% of children with autism have a motor impairment. Why are only about 30% of them receiving physical therapy? And why is that only about 18% of them are receiving recreational movement therapy? So there's a real mismatch that she's calling out that's very illogical, it's very unethical. B, we know that they greatly benefit from physical therapy and recreational therapy. So why is this happening? They qualify for it, they're not receiving it, and they really benefit from it. Check her out. She is a researcher in this decade that is leading the way for autism intervention in the form of movement. So that's someone whose name you're going to want to remember. So it's Bhat is her last name. She's from University of Delaware. Look her up. Things have already come out of her, and I expect only better things to come out of her in the future. So when we look at this article, what I want to underscore here is they had 3 types of movement intervention in which the children were randomly assigned. So you basically pick a popsicle and say, okay, we're going to go and put you in a seated intervention. So you're going to receive this therapy, and it's going to be all of the same strategies. We're going to use all of the same principles. We're going to have the same type of routine, but you're going to be seated at a table. And then we're going to take the second child that we pull a popsicle stick out of. So it's very random. And we're going to have you do gross motor activities. So we're going to have you do like side to side punches, squats, aerobic activities. And you're going to have a partner. And we're going to do all the same routines, all the same effective intervention strategies. But the activity is going to be gross motor exercises in nature. So we're going to do some squats, we're going to do some side-to-side punches, maybe some jumping jacks. These are kind of one step in nature largely. Maybe there's a little bit of a ball play involved, but it's not multiple sequences, multiple steps. Okay. The third popsicle stick that they're going to draw, so this is all random, this is what you're going to get, is you're going to get this intervention where everything's the same, but we are going to have activities in which there's motor sequences. It's kind of like yoga where you have, okay, we're going to have you do the tree pose. So first you're going to stick the leg up, onto your knee, and then you're going to put your arms out to either side and balance, or you're going to do a sun salutation or a downward dog. So there's these sequences of complex movements. And then we're going to do some things to music in which we're going to practice a pattern where there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's the end. So what's really important when we look at these 3 type of exercises and to say is, one, we're not doing gross motor because we're sitting the whole time. So we're going to take gross motor out of the picture. And then if we look at the second activity, we're going to say we're going to do gross motor, and we're going to do exactly kind of what we were doing seated, the same type of routine, the same type of effective strategies, the same type of interventionist. Everything's the same, except you're going to be moving your body in a gross motor sort of way. And you're going to be doing gross motor exercises. Then you look at the third, which was called creative movement. We're going to use sequences of movement. We're going to use yoga poses. We're going to use, multiple step yoga poses. We're going to use multiple steps working with music in the activity. So there's this multiple step component that you don't have with the gross motor. So when you look at these three types of activities, they produce very different outcomes. And this is where things get really exciting. And this is why, if there's anything you take away from this, we have to move away from the table. Now, in my CIS membership, which is highly effective, I get great results. There is a period of time where they are seated. And that is when we practice the speech and language target, or that is where we're practicing the augmentative communication in pointing to the symbols of 84 boards in a robust system. And there is something to be said about that. Because as we're going to find that when you're seated at the table, you get the fine motor gains. And speech in using these complex augmentative robust devices requires fine motor. So I am not one who's an either or. All of your therapy should be away from a table. All of your therapy should be at a table. I'm for a combination. I'm saying there's times when we're focusing on the fine motor, and there's times when we're focusing on the gross motor. And best practice for children with autism is an all of the above proposition. Don't be an either or therapist. If you are an either or therapist, you are really limiting your effectiveness as a therapist. Because as I've said before, autism is multifactorial in nature. It requires a multiple component approach to support this condition. Okay, so let's dive in to the results. And then we'll talk about why are the results different. So when it came to the seated intervention, now I want you to keep in mind what I liked about this approach is the interventionists had the same training. The interventionists were using the same motor learning principles, strategies. They were using a most to least prompting hierarchy. They were staying at an 80% accuracy rate. They were doing everything we know that works. They were using multimodal cueing, which involved print, which involved visual, which involved verbal, which involved touch. So they were doing all the same highly effective evidence-based strategies. The difference is in the activity, okay, that they're engaged in. So fine motor, those that were seated had, this is it, statistically significant greater gains in fine motor. Now, I'm not sure, it's not like a medium large effect size, but they did have better gains in fine motor. And let me explain the why behind that. When you are seated, you have better, the core, the postural control is better. So when the postural control is stabilized, because the child is supported in a seated position, it's easier to move the fine motor. It's easier to use the point for the AAC device. It's easier to use the fine motor in the speech. This is a complex fine motor movement because you have your core stabilized in a seated position. That is much easier than using it when you're standing on a balance beam, okay? Or in a standing position even. So that is supported. So that makes sense. And that is why when I do my CIS activities, what I do is we are seated when we are using our robust communication devices, then we move. We are seated when we are doing our complex sentences or our paragraphs, and we're doing the fine motor print referencing, and we're doing this talking and the speech, and we're doing either speech clarity or we're increasing that length and complexity of the utterance. At this situation, we are seated because this is very fine motor and it requires complex motor coordination. So having that core stabilized really makes it easier. But then we gotta go. We gotta leave the table. So let's talk about the differences when you leave the table and how important it is. That's why you've got to move. Now, I want to tell you this research, I wish it was preschoolers, but beggars can't be choosers. We don't have this at the preschool level. We do have this at the elementary age level. So the research I'm sharing with you, the average age is about age 8 years old, okay? But even at age 8 years old, look at what a difference movement makes. I would argue that if you did this study with preschoolers, you would get even larger gains because neuroplasticity is greater in the brain, and that preschoolers, they don't learn sitting at a table. Preschoolers learn from hands-on experience and from exploring their environment. So for a preschooler to be able to independently manipulate items in their environment and explore a room intentionally and accomplish goals, this would have a huge cascading effect on their learning because preschoolers learn through their hands, multimodally, through their bodies, and through exploring space and objects in space and play. So I would say you would even see more impressive gains at the preschool level. I did this research before looking at vocalizations of children who had a vocabulary of less than 10 words, minimally speaking children. And what I found is I found greater outcomes and pleasurable vocalizations for these children when they were moving than when they were seated. I did the exact same activity with them seated at a table. In the same child, I looked at that child doing the exact same activity when they were moving. And what I found is that when the child was moving, we had more vocalizations in the movement activities, we had more words spoken in the movement activities, and we had more word approximations. It was just better for these children who are mentally speaking. We had much better gains in speech when they were moving than if they did the activity seated at the table in a fine motor sort of activity. So let's dive in to this activity here with these elementary age children and the impact it had. So after only 10 sessions, we have medium to large effect size, meaning like half to full standard deviation improvement on these test scores. And this is what it showed. In the areas of gross motor performance, in the areas of body coordination, in the areas of strength and agility, in the areas of locomotor skills, like ability to walk around in space, and in the abilities of walking endurance. How quickly can you walk from point A to point B? In locomotor skills, they're probably also looking at, can the child ride a bike from point A to point B? Can the child crawl from point A to point B? Can they hop? Can they skip? Can they jump? Locomotor, that's how do they get around from point A to point B? So basically, after only 10 sessions, this is impressive. After 10 sessions, you're happy to see any gains on a test. But they saw a half to a 1 standard deviation gain on average for those who did gross motor movement, or if they did creative movements like yoga or moving to music, than those who sat at the table. But then it goes even further. And this is why I'm telling you the gross motor movement. And the gross motor movements, they were task-oriented movement in nature, in that some of them were like playing catch, shooting a hoop in a basketball. So that's a task. You get better at it every time you do it. Bowling, right? So there was some of that incorporated into it. There was some multiple step sort of activities incorporated into that. But then when we look at the creative movement, that is where we're going to see the gains in executive function. Now, I talk about this when I present. I just presented in Calgary at a full day presentation on autism. Not all movement activities are the same. You're not going to get those gains in executive function if you are doing sensory activities. You're not going to get the gains in executive function if you are doing the activities that are aerobic. You will get the gains in executive function if you are doing multiple step activities. Okay, so think about that. Now, how does that apply? And I want you to think about how can that apply to your therapy. And I'm going to show you how it's evolved for me over the years. So when I started the SIS membership, the SIS activities, I was task-oriented movement activities. You have a goal. This is how you're going to accomplish that goal. I looked it up in physical therapy. Anyone can do it, and it's the most effective way to improve motor skills across the board. So I'm like, sign me up. But we can do better than that. Over the years, I've evolved and I found that how about we do these multiple step movement activities to music? So that's what you see here in this study. They did multiple step activities in coordination with music. And what happened as a result of that? Well, I'm going to go on even further. I said, why don't we do these task-oriented movement activities, these multiple step activities with literacy? Because the research indicates that with literacy, you have an improvement. If you act out the stories, you have an improvement with language comprehension and language expression, as well as literacy comprehension, more so than any other thing if you act it out. So I thought, well, so this idea of task-oriented movement activities, it's like this. It looks like this. You have a goal to accomplish. The child accomplishes the goal. You keep their hands off of them. You, through environmental arrangement, through multimodal cueing, you provide this most to least cueing hierarchy. You provide that support. Step back. You could do that. But then you could also incorporate music. And that's what this study did. They incorporated music. You could also incorporate literacy because stories have this beginning, this middle, and end. And I'm looking at literacy and I'm taking it much more seriously as I ever have in the past. And the reason I'm taking it so much more seriously, I'm just going to be honest with you, is because I met someone at a recent LAMP conference, this guy named Lance, and he had a CNC, those old Texas Instruments that the guy used on E.T. The movie E.T. I know I'm old for saying the movie E.T. is so old. E.T. Go Home. He had a Texas instrument in which he was able to spell out and express himself because he couldn't talk to share his ideas with the world. And I'm looking at the data and I'm saying if 25 to 30% of our children with autism are never going to talk, they need an alternative method to spontaneously generate their ideas. And if they can type out their ideas, if they can type out their ideas, they can make movies, they can make podcasts, they can do anything that any speaker can do in this day and age. So it's something to really consider and to take more seriously is the development of literacy skills for children with autism. This is more than just, we're improving academics. We're not just improving academics. This may be the child's only chance to have a voice in the society. We don't want to be a child's voice. We want them to have their own voice. So how can we do that? Well, if the speech doesn't develop, we need to make sure these children can type out their ideas and express themselves through typing. That is very important. So then in considering that, I was like, we got to get more literacy into these activities. So I take literacy very seriously into the task-oriented movement activities. So suddenly the task-oriented movement activities become multiple step activities in which there's the problem, we're creating the plan, we're taking action, we're checking it to completion. We have that executive function steps. You can do that to do a bowling activity, a task-oriented movement activity, or an activity in which you save all of the animals and you put them in the wildlife sanctuary, of course, instead of the zoo. We're going to be politically correct here. Or you can do that when you have the music activity in which you're going along with music and the song, which is a story in itself. And you're going through those steps. But the active ingredient in all of that is that the child is engaging in complex, multiple step movement activities that have a beginning and a middle and an end. And when the child does that, you're improving their verbal working memory. And when you improve their verbal working memory, you're going to improve speech pathologists, their speech and their language, and their communication, and their gestures, and a whole cascade of other things as well, and their ability to learn and express themselves. So, what did they find? It's no surprise here. The creative movement activities, that these are activities in which they incorporated multiple step activities, such as a yoga sequence, where they incorporated music in a multiple step manner. The key is multiple step manner, right? They found a medium to large. This is after only, very important, this is after only 10 sessions. That's nothing. After 2 months, a standard deviation difference in what they call praxis. Now, when we look at praxis, what is praxis? Praxis is I have an idea of what I need to do. Okay. Then after that, I can motor plan that out. Then after that, I can take action. And then after that, I can take it to completion and execution. That is what we do when we wash our hands. That is what we do when we get dressed in the morning. That is what we do when we go to the bathroom. That is activities of daily living. That is the ability to engage in goal-oriented behavior. This is an area that children with autism struggle with, is to have this idea, this is what I want to do, and to be able to purposely move their bodies in space to achieve that idea and take it to completion. Okay? Very important. Goal-oriented behavior. We don't talk about it enough. And when we look at play, we have these children that we feel stuck in these cause-effect toys. After cause-effect, we have this stage that no one's talking about. And this is what is so hard for them. That's pivotal importance. Goal-oriented behavior. That's what we're talking about, using your body in a multiple step manner to complete an action, to achieve a goal, to completion. So we've seen children who are stuck and they can't initiate it, and they need help initiating the action, and then they're able to take it to completion. We've seen children who start an action and then they can't finish it. They get stuck on something. They're repetitively doing something and they need help moving on into the next step. They're not going to the next step. We've seen children that simply can't take it to completion. They're going to sit there if you leave them to their own devices doing the same thing and not being able to complete something for hours. So that is praxis. If you're a physical therapist, in our field, we look at it as executive function. That is going to be improved upon if you're doing multiple step movement activities. So other research has found that this is the case of martial arts training. It's multiple step movement activities. It's playing an instrument in a song in which there's a beginning, middle, and end. This is multiple step movement activities. It's acting out plays. It's acting out a sequence of behaviors, multiple step movement activities. It's doing a song routine, a dance routine. It's multiple step movement activities. Very, very important. And if you're a speech language pathologist, this is not only going to improve the executive function, it's going to improve that verbal working memory, which, as we know, is the hallmark of developmental language delays. This is hallmark. It's the verbal working memory. And how can we improve it? We can move our bodies. We can move our bodies through multiple step sequences that are meaningful. So that is what the gross motor movement activities didn't have. And they were creative. The gross motor movement activities had a lot of great sports, which was really important because ball play is the language that children speak and how they communicate with each other non-verbally. So there was lots of rich gross motor movement activities involved in there. But what do we need? Very important. We need that multiple step sequence, and we need meaning behind it. So I look at this research and I encourage you, if you haven't already adopted movement into your speech therapy, go ahead. No one said you need to do your mama's therapy, okay? It's time to DSD. It's time to do something different. What I want you to do is I want you to incorporate movement in your activities and not just movement for the sake of movement. Yay, he's bouncing on a ball. I'm doing movement in my activity. He's swinging in a swing. I'm doing movement in my activity. Who's swinging the child? Are you swinging the child? The child's just sitting there? I don't know if there's a movement activity. No, the child is engaged in multiple step movements in a meaningful manner. And there's many ways you can hammer that nail. And it's exciting to me how it is evolved over the years. And the therapy just gets richer and richer and richer and richer and more educationally rich. And the key is it fun? You know, so you're always like, how fun can I make this? That always matters. Not only how fun can I make this, but how rich can I make this? Am I just improving one skill, like their fine motor skills? If you do, go sit at the table. If you just want to improve fine motor, stay at the table. You can do that, or you can incorporate gross motor, and I'm just going to emphasize, I'm going to read it right over to you, medium to large. So we're talking half to full standard deviation gains after only 2 months in gross motor skills. It includes improved body coordination, strength, agility, locomotor skills, and walking endurance. Hey, after 2 months, that's huge. But if you want to take it up a level and you want an additional improvement that's a half to full standard deviation, in praxis, this ability to do multiple step goal-oriented behaviors to achieve a goal, i.e. executive function skills, if you want to improve that to a medium to large effect size, which is huge after only 2 months, then you're going to take it up a level and you're going to have some sort of goal-oriented, meaningful, multiple step motor activity. So what this article shows us is that not all movement activities are created equal. And I think it's exciting because just as we're kind of growing together over the years, I have changed my therapy and it's grown in this direction and this direction and this direction. And it's like a tree. All of these branches just get fuller and fuller and fuller. And as the therapy expands, and at every session you ask, how can I do this better? You're going to do it better. And when you do it better, the children are going to respond and you're going to see gains in more domains. My therapy has improved over the years. I used to just treat a mouth and I saw gains in speech. But now I see gains in socialization. Now I see gains in independent functioning. Now I see gains in confidence. Now I see gains in social relationships. It's not that the strategies have changed so much, it's that the activities have become more educationally rich. My strategies have improved, I'm not going to lie, and I know yours have too over the years. But the activities matter. Keep that in mind. That said, and I hope you join me at the SIS membership drawing board if you haven't already. Just join for a month and then unsubscribe, right? And then you get all the treatment targets. You know what I do. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to take this and do it my own way. Or you can stick with me at the drawing board and keep growing with me. But it's time to do something different, right? I hope to see you at the SIS drawing board. That's going to be in the link below. Come join me there. Just stick around for a month and say, okay, got what you do. See ya. Or you can stay with me. But roll up your sleeves and it's time to make the world a better place, one child at a time. You are always going to be first.